Blood Knowledge, an Eternal Night story, written by 𝗕𝗏, performed by 𝗂𝗲𝗵𝗁. Dram watched as Masters left his office, keeping an eye on his security monitors until the player's avatar had finally left the building. The troublemaker was always bringing new problems to his doorstep, demanding that he provide information at lower than normal rates. Realistically, he really should have said no. But Masters also brought quite a bit of business his way. And anyways, it was good to have an in with someone who was as blunt as the claws that he used. Of course, he had to admit the fact that someone was making a move against Masters meant that things were going to get bloody. The man seemed to think that he was a political player, a smooth operator of some sort. In reality, the only reason no one had ever taken him out was because Masters was really just that good at getting things done, whether it was taking out troublesome players or managing new vampires as they arrived. Add on to that his first mover advantage, and really trying to deal with Jonathan Masters was just too much trouble for what it was worth for most people. He knew things were going to get heated, especially now that Masters was intent on taking action. More importantly, whatever he chose to do, it would have ramifications on the individuals, not just in this city, but other locations as well. Whatever was going on, it likely had something to do with the latest release. Every time an update happened, well, things changed. Reputations and digital fortunes were lost and made each update, with the livelihood and career of professional players always in jeopardy at those times. It'd be worrisome if the developers did a gun gala and gate certain weapons via monthly subscription fees. That one move had killed a third of their player base, made professional players who resold their weapons persona non grata, and left the shooter gaming community reeling for 2 years. Eternal Night, for all its flaws, was relatively stable. It had a dedicated fan base as mid-tier game. Of course, like any middling company, they had designs on growing bigger, which meant drastic changes could and would happen. And Dram really was not looking forward to actually finding a real job, especially since he had almost no useful real-world skills or contacts. All that meant he had a lot of work to get done now, as among other things, everyone would start coming to him for more information. That probably also explained why he bothered to keep in contact with Masters. Like a canary in the coal mine, the vampire had a tendency to catch whiff of new problems faster than anyone else. And since Dram was his preferred supplier, it meant he caught wind of things before anyone else. All of which left him and his various competitors with a lot more work. He glanced down at his keyboard for a second and then looked up to his computer monitors, pulling up his contacts and sending out this tidbit of information to everyone. More importantly, he started the process of dragging them online. Emergency meetings were always hard to organize, especially since nearly half of the players were still out. One of the reasons most people chose to play an information broker was because it required so little actual time in the game itself. Set up the right connections, buy the right secondary programs and contacts, make sure you reviewed your offline parameters for the avatar, and all that information would flow in with minimal problems. The longer you stayed out, of course, the more information the game would dump into you, which was why most regular players would ensure they logged in at least once a day, even if for nothing other than some basic maintenance. Once you did that and reviewed the data, you could hang out with your friends and just play Power Broker. It also meant that they were one of the strongest organizations within the game. After all, if everyone was only part-time, there weren't a lot of egos to deal with. This was played for fun, not for money. And while there were egomaniacs, the nature of being a power broker meant that contacts were important, and anyone who pissed off enough players eventually found themselves frozen out. Not that that impacted Dram very much. After all, he was a full-time player. Had to be, what with his issues in the real world. Better to be here, considered ugly and unwanted, than out there and be considered, well, ugly and unwanted. For a second, Dram's leg jittered. Nervous, rocking energy transferred to a stupid neural tic. He froze as he realized what he was doing and shook his head. No. Here he was Dram. Unwanted, perhaps, ugly certainly, but ugly only in a game sense. More than one assignation had been completed and finished because, well, VR ugly was not the same as real-world ugly. Or something. He had no idea about how people thought, men or women. His leg stopped moving. He forced himself to breathe and relax. In any case, he was Dram here, and he had power. respect, money, and most of all, contacts. Fingers flew across the keyboard, sending out messages to all the other power brokers. Soon enough, he started receiving replies, some confirming information received, others indicating they would look into it further. He read through the messages, and once they started slowing, he leaned back. The question was, what else to do? And really, at the end of the day, the answer was simple. Get moving. Of course, he was a 𝗓𝗏𝗏, named after that old movie. They even modeled much of the makeup and character models off the main character, giving them a flat, smooth head and long ears, as well as eyes that were a little too wide. The truth was, they didn't look human at all, which was ostensibly the major drawback of choosing the 𝗓𝗏𝗏 bloodline in the game. What the creators hadn't realized, while creating a system in-game that was so true to life, was that it also left a huge exploit. Making his way over to an adjacent side room, Dram proceeded to open his wardrobe drawers, scanning through his makeup kit. Quite a few makeup artists had actually joined the game, picking the 𝗓𝗏𝗏 and using the character models as a way to practice their work while playing a game. He wasn't a professional, of course, but there were quite a number of forums, videos, and documents detailing the best methods. After all this time, multiple years doing this, he'd grown a rather deft hand at applying the makeup. First came the bronzer, a little coloring, little change to the ears via some prosthetics and tape. Then the wig, alterations on the eyebrows, and slope of the forehead via applied latex skin, some cheek implants, and even a small, wispy goatee. That was all that was needed to transform him from a very clear and unnatural being to just a normal, though somewhat ugly, human. Grinning into the mirror, Dram gave himself a quick nod and stood up. Time to go. One of the things about dealing with the question of whether someone was going after Masters was the ultimate why. Of course, everyone knew that it had to do with the game update. But what the update actually included, no one exactly knew yet. Oh, there were 1,000,000,001 different theories running around on the internet, everyone somehow feeling that they had their inside scoop on this. Dram knew, though, that the company was extremely vigilant about letting any information leak from the outside. That didn't mean he didn't understand that there were information leaks on the inside, little hints that the company purposefully left in their minor updates, information that was passed on to their own NPCs to make sure that the players who knew about how the game was played could set themselves up for future success. Over the multiple versions that Dram had played, there were more than a few players who had managed to make their name by correctly guessing what the next evolution of the game would be. Positioning yourself way in advance to make the most of an update could easily make a vampire, or just as easily break them. As for himself, he wasn't one of those lore masters. Dram's focus had always been figuring out what the players were currently doing. That didn't mean he was entirely in the dark about the rumors of upcoming changes, but he did leave it for others to figure out before he swooped in and paid for their hard-earned knowledge. Even so, with new moves being made, it was clear he was behind the curveball this night. It was not a position he enjoyed being in, which meant he needed to get active. In this case, there were a few people he knew who were likely to know something. All of that was a long way of saying he was out and about this night, leaving his much vaunted, highly protected residence. He hated doing that, really, but even now, going out as Dram instead of his meat body was different. He couldn't exactly put a finger to it, and it still drained him mentally and emotionally to interact with others even in the game. Still better than real life. It probably said something about his world and himself, that if someone had really cared, they would probably have had a chat with him about therapy. Luckily, Dram didn't have friends or family in that sense. None at least who would have noticed the fact that he had not actually left his apartment other than to toss the garbage away in over 2 months. Maybe it was because he was a fellow introvert that Cassia actually let him in. He listened as the metal door slid open, the gates pivoting on smooth pistons, allowing him entrance into her high-rise condo. Set in the middle of the city, it had one of the best views he had ever seen, a full 360-degree observation of the world below. It amused him, really, that it was an introvert vampire that owned the most expensive piece of real estate that he personally had entered. Even in game worlds, it was a staggering level of cost that beggared his own mansion on the edges of the city. And unlike Cassia, he had land. Even more amusing, It was not as if she would ever make use of it during the day when sunlight streamed in and would cook her vampire body. UV shielding and curtains could only do so much, even when the game made some allowances to ensure that players could play during the daytime. What were vampires if they could go out in daylight? Well, he knew the answer to that one, and they were called fangers, looked down upon by the majority of serious players, though, of course, they had their own subculture in Eternal Night. In fact, Dram had to admit they probably were a larger percentage of the gaming population than the Bloods like him. Still, he paid little attention to them since their intrigues, their method of playing, bisected his own business little. As he strode in, Dram found Cassia lounging, looking over the city below as she browsed the web and had a chat with someone in her living room. Dram flicked his gaze over the other gentleman, marking name and face and bearing. It didn't take long to figure out that he was human. The beat of his heart, the human stink, was quite present and noticeable. He assumed he was another one of her blood dolls, another one of her tendrils reaching out into the city. Dram worked with individuals and vampires, real ones. Cassia worked with the game system, using blood dolls and paid informants all over the city to give her the same level of information. Of course, what she wanted and what she was interested in was really the lore of the world. It was why entire sections of this penthouse was dedicated to her library, the accumulated knowledge that she'd acquired over the last 3 major version updates of the game. Those version updates had been interesting. The first had been the expansion of the cities, going from a few major cities per time zone to almost a dozen major locations all across the major time zones. That expansion had been one of necessity, with a series of other minor updates, including the first introduction of the Daytime Logged Off series. The second version update had added smaller villages and cities, a location for those who wanted to replicate certain popular book series in the game and those who had no desire to fight for control in the bigger cities. The third major update had added even more cities, floating locations, and the influence system, along with a large number of new bloodlines that had been expanded. At that point, the daytime avatar mods had reached its current status, in all the major ways at least. "Dram, what is it that you want?" Cassia said upon seeing him fully enter. "Right to the point as usual," Dram said. "Would you have it any other way?" "No. It's very refreshing, really, after dealing with all of the others." Dram took a seat, knowing that she would never actually offer him one. "I'm actually here about the upcoming update. I'm getting the feeling that this isn't just another city or another set of influencers or new bloodlines. This seems to be a major one." "And, of course, you think I know what it's going to be. Or at least have a clue." Cassia laughed, then shook her head at Dram. "I have nothing definitive. And anyway, you think you're the only one looking for this information? What do you think? That I would let you know over anyone else?" Because you know I'll pay well for whatever information you do acquire?" Dram had to smile, flashing her his fangs. "You know me so well." "So?" she asked. Dram reached into the messenger bag he'd been carrying. He pulled the wrapped item out, one redolent with rot and mold. He hated parting with the item, though he had scanned every single page beforehand. Still, the original item was the only thing that would do with collectors like Cassia. He gently placed the book on the table, lifting the cloth covering. Cassia stared at the book, leaning forwards until the system finally gave her some details. Then she let out a little gasp, instinctively reaching for it. Dram pulled the book a little away, more of a reminder than an actual attempt at taking it aside. After all, she never made it all the way across the space between them. The movement was enough to halt Cassia's aborted actions, though she couldn't help licking her lips in hunger. That's an original translation of the Blood Chronicles by Evan Carl, isn't it? You authenticated it, right? Cassia said. Of course you did. You wouldn't bring it to me if it wasn't. Dram smiled thinly, knowing that he had her. Cassia sighed in agreement and nodded to Dram. Fine. As I said, I don't know anything for sure. But there's been a lot of rumblings about wild dogs, about small settlements being taken over, vampires disappearing. A lot of NPCs have been culled, the ones that travel between cities or that lived in or moved out to small towns. It almost seems like they're trying to push all of us into the major hubs. Dram frowned. That made no sense. The game was doing well. Not great, but not horribly. Player population had stabilized. Profits probably weren't bad either, though maybe they were trying to reduce server load? That would make sense on the meta perspective. Then again, wouldn't it make current players upset? He shook his head, repeating her other statements. Wild dogs? Well, come on if you know your meta lore. Son of a bitch, Dram swore as he realized what she was getting at. I did not sign up for that kind of game. Cassia sighed. Me neither, but they'll do what they want to do. Dram sat back, considering his next steps. This was a big change. So big that he wasn't entirely sure he could trust the news from Cassia alone. After all, even she had said that she was uncertain that this was true. Rumors weren't reality, after all. Maybe... Dram looked down, then pushed the book forwards before standing up. I want your sources, and all the details, obviously. Any additional confirmation or news that you get pertaining to this. Cassia just nodded, waving away Dram. He chuckled as he walked off, catching her lunging for the book the moment he'd moved away from it. He figured he'd get the actual information later that day when the system kicked her out and she had to set up her avatar to do some offline tasks. In the meantime, he had others to talk to. Asking questions, knocking on doors, speaking to those who should be in the know. That was all that Dram did for the next few hours, porting between destination to destination, his character put on autopilot every time he had to travel. Of course, the actual travel time between locations was a lot faster than it would have been in the real world, since no one joined a game to spend the majority of their time gaming in traffic, going from location to location. Even then, to help create the gameplay elements of being in a city, travel time was part of the game. All of which meant that Dram found himself logging into the game forums a lot, perusing threads that he had initially dismissed. There were a lot of threads by noobs and spammers and just your general pranksters, all of them insisting that they had some special insight into the upcoming update. The vast majority he could easily dismiss, either being really bad update ideas. No, they weren't going to be introducing hunters with, silver swords, and dumpiers who could walk through daylight or add in the option to play in the Dark Ages. All of that would just be broken or entirely too expensive. And of course, there was no way in high heavens the developers would introduce something as dumb as ghosts. Who wanted to play a character that couldn't interact with everyone else except in very specific circumstances? The kind of gameplay value on such an addition would be incredibly low, especially for the sheer volume of resources it would require. Still, for all of that, Dram did find a few nuggets of information that might be considered substantiation over Cassia's insinuation. For example, traveling vampires who asserted that certain stops on their regular route, which used to be perfectly fine, were now barred to them. Whether it was because their characters received a strange feeling that they weren't supposed to go there while automated and their avatars replotted to a new city, or in a few cases, when they pushed it while they were in-game, they were sent straight to respawn. Areas of influence suddenly disappearing, shrinking down as smaller cities disappeared from call lists, contacts and individuals no longer answering. There were even indications that certain players who had taken over smaller cities were finding themselves sent to respawn, awakening with their houses destroyed, their lairs shattered, all of which resulted in the players and their characters being forced into the main cities. Influence, blood dolls, resources were all changing on a subtle level, one that resulted in certain vampires thinking they had a chance at either expanding or needing to do so, rumblings of which Dram himself had seen, though he had taken it to be caused by just the ebb and flow of vampiric politics. There was even an entire article about someone being told stories of shifters and other weird creatures that inhabited the night during an evening-long soiree hosted by a well-known NPC vampiric duke in his mansion. Stronger, faster, more powerful than any vampire. Dram kind of figured that was propaganda, of course, historical and world-building notes to pump it all up. Chances were the developers would balance the two races out. After all, no one wanted to play a species that would be significantly underpowered. Which meant, of course, Dram was knocking on doors trying to find people who he should be talking to. "Richard, been meaning to talk to you," Dram said, listening as his call was connected. One finger rested on the floating table that let him browse the forums, the other hand holding up the phone. Always nice to have drivers. In the background of the call, he could hear the play of waves on the water, the shriek of a seagull that was still up even this late at night. Amazing how detailed the game was, even for something as simple as a phone call. "Dram, there a problem with the report I sent?" "Nah, the wharf details were good." What he didn't mention was that he had only one buyer now, ever since Lynette had quit the game. Her NPC avatar had cut down on such expenses when it took over, leaving the avatar more vulnerable. The usual routine: the NPCs would take care of the interest groups, resources, and blood dolls the player directly owned. But anything outside of that and any concerted efforts to take it all away was not guarded against. It allowed new players ways to go after already owned locations with less risk while also keeping older avatars in play, such that if a player picked up the game again, they did not necessarily have to start from zero. But none of that was Richard's problem. He ran a small gang, playing hardcore vampires in the Wharf group, throwing their weight around and fighting a couple of other local gangs. There were a consistent flow of quests down in the Wharf, from drug smuggling, human trafficking, body disposals, and ranging NPC vampire groups who might come in to cause problems. Never mind the interactions between the NPC police and Wharf authorities, the hunts that might impact the area and the homeless who hid around abandoned warehouses. "So what's the call about then?" said Richard. Right. Been getting more new vampires coming in? Controlled or not?" "Yeah, now that you mention it. Refugees, some coming in from other coastal locations. There's rumblings that there's some new monster on the seas too, taking out floating hives. Think you can ask around for me? Get more details about these new monsters or what drove those people out? What do I get about it? Double the usual rate?" "Double, eh?" Richard paused. Then Dram could almost see the smile across the line. "Well, that sounds very good." "Great. You know how to contact me." Dram exchanged a few more pleasantries and clarified the scope before closing the line. He looked around, realizing that they had come to a stop against a nightclub. Vampiric nightclubs, hidden in warehouses or under retail stores, were all the rage. Not that Dram ever liked visiting them. Partly because, as he strode in after being let through the damn solid metal doorway, of them, the vampires that clustered these environs. The heavy beat of club music, all bass and rhythm, rang through the underground locale, the constant press of figures highlighted by the UV and colored strobe lights. There was a wide array of colors and clothing on display, though black and skimpy predominated. More than a few individuals sported collars and tattoos, marks of ownership from one fanger or another. And it was a fanger-heavy crowd, Dram could tell. That was, after all, the point of these things. It was here that those who indulged in casual play hung out the most, reenacting bad Interview with the Vampire or Blade movie scenes, lusting over figures and trying for a level of cool they might never reach in real life. Harmless romance, a chance for individuals to practice flirting. Even if 3/4 of the blood dolls in here were NPCs, the romance and interaction routines built into the software were quite complex at this time. Multiple interactions, multiple responses, all recorded over thousands of hours of gameplay and consolidated into a machine learning routine. All of which led to, "Hey babe, you're looking smoking tonight," followed by a long, low grin by a spiky-haired, leather-bedecked fanger. No verbal response, just the roll of the eyes by the pretty goth blood doll preceded by a flip of the hair. Then she stalked off only to be grabbed by the arm, turned towards another. "You bothering you, babe? Don't worry, I've got you back. Maybe a drink?" Another smile, another attempt. This one went better, though Dram noted the flicker in the fanger's eyes, the use of a blood skill. Not his business. Let them play. Figure out how to interact and flirt with women, NPCs or not. He did note how the real players were more popular, how men and women clustered around those blood dolls in eager anticipation. Idly, Dram flicked through his mental Rolodex, putting names to faces for some of them, taking snapshots of others for additional research later. Fingers moved in and out of the game so fast it was often hard to keep track of. Now, where was... there? On a raised stage, to the right, was the DJ table. Behind it, another player, playing tunes, controlling the dance floor, raising the roof. Or did the kids even use that anymore? Dram had to believe there were new terms, but what with the majority of his daily interactions either online or media from television and audio sticks, he was rather behind. Crossing the edge of the dance floor, pushing through the groups, he kept his head down, hoping he could get a word in with one of his few contacts that kept the beat of the finger groups. Pun intended. "Look who's here!" A hand barred his way, slick polyester shirt covering a pale hand. The voice was raised, but not fully shouting, one of the game's minor alterations on reality to allow actual speech in a dance floor when everyone would have been shouting or screaming their voices hoarse. "Hmm?" Dram looked up and was too late to hide the wince. The man standing before him in his purple shirt and sunglasses in a club, had long blonde hair so light it might even be white. His shirt was unbuttoned nearly to his diaphragm, the pale ripple of androgynous, flat muscles showing beneath. Unfortunately, the man and his three companions were all well known to the vampire. "Gordy!" "Gordon," said the man. "What are you doing here, ugly?" "Really? Ugly? That's the best you can come up with?" Dram said, shaking his head. He pushed sideways, trying to get around the arm. "None of your business." Gordon surged forward, blocking Dram off even as he signaled his friends. Idly, Dram scanned the group, noting only one other was actually there. The other two were running offline avatar programs, though they were all player characters. So he wasn't outnumbered 4-1, just 2-1, since the offline defaults would push them away from fighting. Even if they did turn off the combative defaults, their actual ability to engage in combat was lousy. Then again, fighting in the middle of a crowded nightclub, vampire hangout or not, was a bad idea. "I'm talking to you, sewer breath." Gordon leaned in, sticking his nose bare inches from Dram. "Your kind aren't wanted here." Dram rolled his eyes. That only infuriated the other player, who moved a hand upwards, only for Dram to catch at it. "Don't. You know what happens if we get into a fight here," Dram hissed. "And while I don't care about being banned, I don't think the same holds true for you, does it?" Gordon froze for a second, eyes snapping down. "You think you can set others on me? Mess with my women and get away with it? You think you can flaunt your ugly mug in here and just saunter out?" "Firstly, I sell information. You want to know who caused you problems? Just ask. If you want to know the best way to hurt them, just ask." Not that it would matter. After all, the people that had bothered Gordy here had left for another city over 2 months ago. Then again, holding grudges was what the internet was best at. "I don't differentiate, I just sell. It's my job." "I'm just following orders," Gordon replied, raising his voice into a high and whining one. "Heard that one before." Dram narrowed his eyes and then shook his head, bending a little and pushing forwards. No point arguing. At some point, it just stopped making sense to do so. Better to just, get on with it. He pushed in, shoulder turning to push against the other. Surprised by the change, Gordon stumbled back a little, only to catch himself. He growled, fangs dropping down a little, but the gap was just enough for Dram to squeeze around him. A hand dropping on his shoulder was shed as he let himself twist and drop downwards, and then Dram was past the blockade, squeezing past a pair of girls and a server. A pull on his bloodline ability, and Dram faded into the background. Shadows pulled around his body as the game helped shroud his presence. It took him a few steps further and squeezing into a corner before he was truly safe, while the group hurried around trying to find him, making a mess of it. The vampires watched as security arrived, dealing with the disruptive group and tossing them out of the nightclub for the night. Smirking a little, Dram detached himself from the shadows, letting his blood fade away, idly noting the flashing icon in the corner indicating a need to feed. Well, talk to Spinner first. God, gamers were horrible at naming conventions sometimes. Spinner for a DJ. Talk to Spinner, then go feed. Then keep looking, because as amusing as this interaction had been, he still had a job to do and a rumor to verify. one that might just make him a decent chunk of change and increase his reputation. The conversation with the DJ had gone about as well as could be hoped for. Dram had to wait for nearly 20 minutes before Spinner took a break, at which point a quick and hushed conversation had revealed the Fangers had seen nothing. Not that they called themselves that, but the answer was the same anyway. They had not noticed. So, another dead end. He had, of course, left instructions to keep an ear out. Then he had slipped out, carefully watching for potential trouble. Luckily, the fools had moved on rather than try to find him and continue their conversation. For a second, as he waited for his car to come around, Dram considered hiring someone to beat some sense into them. That was the way it was done, after all. Someone like Masters, or probably someone cheaper, would do. Sending their characters off to respawn once or twice, and they'd learn their lesson. Then Dram dismissed it. Those kind of actions could have unforeseen consequences to his business. No, he was a neutral party. That was what he had said, and no matter what, he had to play it that way. Climbing into the car, Dram glanced at his clock and sighed. For the first time, Dram found himself with nothing better to do than feed before he was to meet another. They were still on the way, just so that he didn't have to wait. But it was going to be at least an hour or more before his next contact was meant to meet up with him. He debated taking a few minutes offline, grabbing a drink and a snack in the real world and stretching his body. After all, keeping himself healthy was important, especially when half his day meant lying in bed staring into the void. Right now, he was in the middle of browsing through another thread that was insinuating a number of humorous and lewd acts that the developers could do, rebalancing the poster's favorite bloodline abilities in the most recent update. Half the people commenting were just taking side bets on how long before the original poster's account was muted or even banned. That was when the entire car lurched to the side. Metal shrieked, the entire car tipping over as the powerful forces in play kicked in. He tumbled, along with the vehicle, over and over with the car's body compressing and bending, glass shattering, his entire body jerking as the seatbelt pulled against him and kept him tied down. Dram's head spun, crown knocking against the sides of the car. A vertigo and minor concussion debuff popped up in his screen. Seconds later, the software fed the very same sensations to his body, throwing his sense of balance off, making him feel like he was drunk. For obvious reasons, the company wasn't going to go and give him a brain injury, so this was their version of it. It took him a while once the vehicle came to a stop, Dram upside down and hanging on only by the simple canvas item. Eventually, fumbling fingers just gave up, and he yanked the entire metal apparatus apart using his intense bloodline-gifted strength to do so. After all, he was a vampire even if he wasn't exactly geared to combat. With Dram landing on his neck, the software threw another series of debuffs at him, making him lurch to the side and rebalance against the upside-down upholstery. Heh, upholstery. Upside down. Biting his lip, Dram slammed energy down his body, sending the healing aspects of his vampiric body into overdrive. The debuff cleared, giving him a clear sense of what was happening at last. Someone like Masters, that big lout that he was, would likely have exploded out guns blazing, ready to do battle. That was his thing, after all. He might have been as blunt as a 200-year-old training sword, but the vampire knew how to fight. It was one of the reasons why he'd lasted as long as he had. Dram, on the other hand, had spent most of his gaming time behind the desk, or in a few cases over a cup of warm blood. No, he wasn't going to head out like a fool. He wasn't geared to fight, but he did have his own abilities. Another breath, a quick overview of his blood tank. Not a lot, not enough. First steps, he grabbed the insulated bottle within, popping open the cap to down the emergency blood. It took him back up to 3/4 of his resource pack, and if the blood tasted a little like lukewarm curry, well, it was what it was. Next, he tapped into Shadow, the bloodline ability for his kind, and faded into the darkness. Even looking down upon himself, he could barely see where he was, and he knew that for any other player he would be as good as invisible. He might not have a lot of skills, unlike some, but he dedicated a heck of a lot of his points to a few specialized abilities. Who needs to fight when you can run? On the other hand, he was in an upside-down car with bad guys probably on the way. Even as Dram finished considering that fact and put himself fully on his feet, the door leading to the nearest side where they had hit him started shrieking in protest. Already buckled metal further twisted and ripped, forcing Dram to stare in incredulity. Exactly how many points had that idiot put into vigor? He briefly debated a few options before pulling out the roadside flare that he always kept with him. Pulling it close, he waited until the door was entirely wrenched open and he could see outside. Something big, something hairy, and something very, very angry was waiting outside. Definitely not a vampire. More like a big dog, or maybe a wolf. Shit. Dram lurched outside, trusting in his ability to work as he scrambled forwards. He was 3/4 of the way out before the creatures sniffed the air and turned towards where he was. Scent. The vampire cursed, knowing that his ability might have been compromised. But that was what the flare was for. Striking it with a swift motion, he then shoved it straight into a creature's mouth while it was still reacting to the fact that light had just bloomed and a vampire had appeared right next to his face. Shadow Body was powerful, but the bloodline ability did have some disadvantages, including offensive actions making it less potent. Dram's hand went 2/3 of the way in, shoving the blazing phosphorus flare into the creature's mouth. The beast yowled in pain, and it reflexively clamped down on his arm. Dram, of course, proceeded to drop the weapon, even as the system sent pain notices to him. Another twist, a clawed hand catching his thigh as he was lifted and tossed aside by the hairy monster's powerful neck muscles. Long claws shredded his suit and his muscles beneath, even as he arced through the air, the monster clawing and hacking at its throat a second later. Once more tumbling through the air, the vampire bounced off the ground, nearly hit a passing car, and then fetched up against the sidewalk. Light from nearby lamplights glowed, displaying the scene of the accident, the growing pool of curious passersby. Stupid masquerade AI routines. Arm bleeding, Dram scrambled backwards, finding a pool of darkness near a parked car and fading into it as the combat countdown ticked down, leaving him in the shadows once more. Once the damn combat countdown disappeared, he would be fully hidden, and he could run. Even if the monster could scent him, it had to have a debuff after having its throat and nose singed. Or he hoped, at least. Then again, running wasn't going to tell him what the monster was. And since Mohammed had been trying to go to the mountain and the mountain had arrived, he might as well greet it properly. Hairy wolf. Monster. Werewolf. Shifting to the side, watching as the creature finally plucked the roadside flare out of its throat and threw it aside, and then howled, Dram took a number of screenshots, forcing the system to record all of this for him. He couldn't, of course, use this in the game, but there was nothing stopping him from showing it as offline verification. It was one of those things where you could metagame the entire information selling business. Of course, you didn't want to do that too much, otherwise the entire company would come down on you. Still, in moderation, it worked well. More importantly, Dram was no longer near where the creature had first seen him, while he waited to see what the monster would do next. He was far enough away that he should have trouble finding him, and the unleashing of a couple of simple pepper packets where he last was ensured that his scent was going to be mixed up a little. Not perfect, but a good start. After all, scent was one of those things that he'd had to deal with even with other vampires, if much less often, so he had his own method of handling it. The creature obviously was significantly more sensitive to his smell, though, which made sense, since it was a werewolf. Come out, wherever you are, you little blood bag. I'm gonna eat you and get my quest points. Dram rolled his eyes, but he was kind of glad for the taunting. If he was a player and this was a quest line, it wasn't an NPC-generated problem. That also meant that it was definitely an update coming with these creatures. Of course, the question was why a player who had access to a new character race was coming and bothering Dram now. Everything that he'd heard indicated that they were in the outskirts, not the main cities. "What do you want?" "Why me?" Dram called out, making sure to project his voice away from him and off the sewer grate. Ventriloquism was a very useful skill to learn. He'd been trying to learn it in real life, but without the computer software taking over and basically doing it for him for the most part, it was a lot harder. Unfortunately, the shifter might be new and rather talkative, but he wasn't stupid. He didn't jump at the voice, he just stalked around, sniffing at the air. You're just a quest, little vampire. Came down a few hours ago since you bloodsuckers don't know when to stop asking questions. A little laugh, one that cut through the night and chilled Dram's blood. It was hungry, predatory. A part of Dram, the rational part, had to give the developers credit. It was bloody scary. You keep asking questions, and I keep having to go and put all of you down. Dram frowned at the implication. One hand on the ground, the other caressed the insides of his jacket and the objects within. You've had to kill a few of us, then? More than a few. Of course, I got to travel a little bit and do that, but it doesn't really matter. You all think you're so smart, with all your bloodline abilities and all your skills, and really you're just prey. When he finished speaking, the shifter spun on the balls of his feet and lunged, headed straight for Dram. Dram snorted, dropping low and shoving his hand straight. He might not be a fighter, but he certainly knew better than to go and throw himself at an unseen target, trusting surprise to carry the day. He'd been in enough scuffles to know that not all of his abilities would work all the time. Yanking out the stake and holding it before him at an angle was a matter of moments. He watched as the silver-tipped, ashen body stake sank deep into the creature's chest. It buckled a little in his hand, almost slipping out under the sheer force of the other monster's momentum. Another arm, raised a little, and his head hidden under the raised shoulder all got clipped by the flailing arms, drawing streaks of blood and tearing skin open. Dram had been old school, having started playing when all the rumors about the different kinds of vulnerabilities between vampires had been par for the course. No one really knew what was real, what was fake, especially with all the different bloodline vulnerabilities. Among the discussions had been that of silver being particularly dangerous. Of course, that rumor had been disproved a while ago. There were, of course, a couple of bloodlines that were particularly vulnerable to having silver used on them, but really, put anything through the heart and most vampires dropped. The additional costs of adding silver to a stake just weren't worth it, which was why silver-tipped stakes had grown out of favor. Except for people like Dram, who'd picked up his own armament ages ago and then, not having the focus on combat, still had them. The fact that he had bought a ton of them at a discount when crafters and other groups were doing their best to clear their inventory had a lot to do with the fact that he still had boxes of these things sitting around at home. Silver-tipped stakes, entire drumfuls of holy water, pounds and pounds of earth transported from Transylvania and funeral homes, even a half-dozen coffins. In a warehouse, he still was trying to get rid of the entire factory run of UV-coated mirrored glass he'd picked up too. All kinds of random items once rumored to be useful or necessary. Or, in this case, finally useful again. The weapon sank into the wolf's chest like a hot knife through butter. Dram couldn't help but smile a little, watching as it went all the way in. A quick jerk of his arm broke the weakened end off, leaving the stump inside the chest before he scrambled out of the way of the weakly batting arms. Weak only in a sense, since those claws were sharp and took skin with them each time they connected. On his feet, Dram surveyed the damage. One side of his body was all torn up, hanging flaps of skin and muscle where the blows had ripped through his body without end. Blood dripped from it, slowly and steadily, even as the sound of screams and shouts generated from AI-run NPCs broke through the battle haze. A lot of damage. Luckily, Dram was not one of those realism is a must fools, and he had his pain thresholds dialed all the way down, as far as they would allow him, really, which meant that while it was annoying for certain actions and made him clumsy, it wasn't debilitating to have his avatar all torn up. The werewolf struggled upright once, lunging for him. He skipped backwards, keeping out of the way, the player's other hand scrabbling for the tip of the stake. It tore into skin itself, even as the bleeding and staked debuff sapped the monster's energy. Cheat! Goddamn cheater! You mods! Report you! The werewolf coughed out. Dram stepped aside, watching as the body thrashed around for a few more seconds before it stopped. And then the body began to shrink, transforming into a man's. Then and only then did the vampire relax, scanning about him, catching sight of a variety of humans and other passers-by watching the scene. He sighed, realizing that there was going to be a lot more work involved in this night than he had expected. Damn Masters. Even when he wasn't around, he was creating problems for Dram. Life as an information purveyor in Eternal Night was particularly simple. His job mostly involved talking to people, dealing with individuals and vampires who needed to get the scoop on others. All of that meant that it was his wide range of contacts, the spies and the other fangers who gave him his information. It also meant that while he rarely ever needed to make use of a cleaner, he definitely had their contacts. In Eternal Night, there were two ways that you could engage such services. There were a few in-person vampire avatars that were run by players who did the job. For the most part, they weren't particularly well respected since most of them just weren't online often enough to make them reliable. And while the system AI could and did run the business for them, their offline characters were also limited because of the very same hard-coded scripts that safeguarded characters from taking active part in violent situations and forcing a combative response when the player wasn't present. After all, no one wanted to log on and find themselves unable to act, as their character had been killed or was otherwise respawning. All of which meant that unless a situation was considered very clear, such offline avatars were of little use, especially since cleaning situations were dynamic and often ripe for additional problems. Even though there were ways of extending the core AI script, expanding the options and scenarios that the avatars were allowed to interact within, there were still hard-coded limits, all of which really meant that for the most part it was NPCs that everyone went to when they needed to clean a scene. Dram was very much the same way, having contacted not one but two different groups to help him out with his predicament. The first cleaning crew were there to take away the body, chaining it down so that additional experimentation could be conducted on the corpse. They also washed down the body and removed any residue from the fight scene, whether it was Dram's own blood or the werewolf's. Standard procedures. Of course, Dram had made his way over to the transformed body and looted it beforehand, which was why he was standing over in one corner, hidden using shadow once more and going over the phone that he had extracted. Seriously, 9876 is not a password, he muttered, having finished trying to crack the phone. He'd tested the most common ones just in case, because, well, otherwise he'd have to do it in his mansion. Now, let's see what we have here. Quick snapshot of the phone contacts and a simple dongle to download all saved offline data to the USB first. That was easy enough and ensured that even if the phone was wiped later, he'd have some information on hand. Next. This name is familiar. Ashton. Last phone call. Incoming, too. Dram debated for a second before he shrugged and hit dial. Long seconds waiting for the phone call to answer. Idly, the vampire watched the second cleaning crew work. The second crew dealt with the squishier problems, such as the humans who had noticed the entire event along with all the various electronic, mobile, and digital recordings that had been taken. It was, thankfully, relatively constrained in Eternal Night, unlike in the real world. So long as you paid enough money or plugged in enough resources to the cleaning crew, and most players were prompted to use the right level, everything would be locked down. After all, the point of all of this wasn't to make life miserable for players, but to keep the overall atmosphere of the game intact. It made little sense to create a game about hidden overlords of the night and have the first idiot player break it all open. It made everyone's life simpler that there were basic cleaner services, while also making sense. In fact, Dram knew of at least a half-dozen major storylines that had run through nearly the same number of cities involving NPC cleaners and player-created incidents. If you constantly had vampires running around causing trouble, you definitely didn't want hundreds of recordings floating around the world, which was why major quests were involved in dispelling or disappearing such pieces of evidence. Even so, there was still about a half-dozen records that had to be scrubbed from the internet well before they became a problem. The faster you got them done, the cheaper and easier it was to contain the problem. This was going to be expensive. Yeah? It done? The voice over the phone replied. Ashton. That's how I know the name, Dram replied, shaking his head. The idiot fanger from the club, the one who had threatened him. Now, why are you on this contact list? You! You're alive! Nah, pretty dead, like you, Dram said, drumming his fingers on his thigh. You're the one who sent him after me, huh? I'm not saying anything, panicked Ashton replied hurriedly. Okay. You can't… What? I said okay. You don't have to say anything to me. I got everything I needed when you answered the phone. Though… Dram trailed off, mind spinning. At least this answered how the quest had been generated. The question was, why are you working with the 𝗲s? And how? I told you, I'm not saying anything. Before Dram could answer, another voice, much thinner and in the background, hissed, Kill the call already, you idiot. Wait! Dram sighed, realizing the call had ended before he could prod for more information. Still, at least two of them know. He didn't recognize the second voice, but it certainly was fascinating that somehow the Fingers knew, or this Ashton. Then again, on a meta level it makes sense. Aren't there a few series where the vampires and 𝗲s are friends? What was it, Fang and Claw? Or was that the sexy one? Dram muttered, staring up at the night sky. He'd been slacking on his supernatural fiction reading. It helped knowing the general meta. Sir? A voice, grovelly and low, took Dram out of his thoughts, and he focused on the blood servant, smiling thinly. Yes? We have a few issues we need your help on, the NPC murmured. Rolling his eyes, Dram discarded the thoughts of Ashton. Later. Right now, he had a more immediate set of problems to handle. It seemed that the existence of the werewolf presence had thrown the routine NPC cleaner programs in disarray. Another clue, perhaps, dropped by the developers to begin the process of adding in the new expansion. Maybe. Or just bad coding. Sometimes it was hard to tell deliberate intention from lucky accident when you were on the outside. Either case, over the next few hours, Dram was forced to request help from his various sources to suppress any information about his most recent actions. He also took the opportunity to press upon them that he wanted any information on people who might be looking into him. Might as well kill two birds with one stone. Once it was all settled and he had organized a coroner to look over the body and run all the tests they could think of, daylight had begun to stream through the windows of his real-world apartment. His eyes had already begun to hurt, his body reminding him that it had other bodily needs. Even worse, the health and wellness system was already beeping at him, insisting that he had to log off. Annoying, especially since he paid for top-of-the-line hardware, but what could you do? After a number of others had managed to kill themselves staying indoors and plugged in for too long, the company had gotten even more stringent, making sure that anyone who even tried to bypass their safeguards was removed from the game entirely. They had no desire to face another lawsuit. Popping the helmet off, Dram rotated his neck and ran a hand through sweaty hair. He'd gotten a little worked up towards the end there, making calls and speaking with people. Back in the real world, he had to admit, the acrid stink of old sweat and excess adrenaline from the fight hung in his bedroom, mixing with the stale air to make him wrinkle his nose. Rolling off the bed, he limped over to the only window he had, propping it open to let the air circulate. Bouncing a little on his feet, Dram shook some blood back into his legs. A whole night's work, and he had a human body, some recordings, and almost definite knowledge of what the next update would contain. Now, the question was, how did he position himself, the knowledge he had gathered, and his allies for the upcoming update? And most importantly, what was it with the Fingers and the 𝗲s? Were they really just playing out one of those shifter vampire romance books? Or was there something a little deeper going on? Had all this been happening under his nose to help balance the internal politics of the world and he had missed it? Or was this a one-off occurrence? Wandering into his kitchen, Dram popped open the fridge, searching through half-eaten takeout containers. Fried rice that smelled a little off? Garbage. Half-eaten burrito that, well, smelled okay, but nah. Back in the fridge. Oh, curry. That was always good. Not bothering with the rice, he grabbed a spoon and started eating the cold curry while leaning against the fridge, mind turning over his options. So, what did he have? A body, but currently the corpse looked like any other human male. The silver steak wasn't going to be particularly useful. Most things died from being staked. Unless the coroner came back with variant DNA records or something else, all he had was a series of blurry recordings and his own word. Even the digital recordings weren't completely foolproof. A series of stories about disappearing locations, again circumstantial. Some stories from Bloods who had weird feelings, And, of course, Ashton. Tossing the empty curry container aside, he wiped his mouth and grabbed a pop, breaking the seal on the drink as he considered his next steps. Overall, a lot more learnt than he had truly expected in a single day. So with morning would come another shift. Different players, different viewpoints. Perhaps it was time to let someone else take the reins of the investigation. Hunt down Ashton and his crew, burrow into Fanger's subculture. Figure out what the hell was going on. Most importantly, how they could benefit from all this information. Quaffing the pop and letting out a little belch, Dram grinned. He knew just the person. Walking over to his computer, humming to himself, he mentally began composing the email he was about to send. No reason to wait till he could log in to give his friend the heads up. All in all, maybe Masters wasn't the complete problem he thought he was. Though he was still going to charge the man double the next time he saw him. Getting cut up was never fun. The end. You have been listening to Blood Knowledge, written by Tao Wong, performed by Joe Hempel. Copyright 2022 by Tao Wong. Production copyright 2022 by Starlit Publishing.